everyone. I'm very grateful to be here, and it's nice to see you all. You've got a very long day ahead of you, and so I'm going to get started right away. I hope the coffee has kicked in. For those of you who stayed out too late last night, I hope the Advil has kicked in. If your head is a little fuzzy from staying out too late, then you arrive at this event in the tradition of some of those who've covered campaigns before you. The topic today is the changing landscape, and I started to make a list of all the things that are changing, and it went on too long, so I'm going to try and make a virtue of that, which is to say part of our job is not just to report a story, but to figure out which aspect of a story to report. So I'm going to ask all three of our panelists to be assignment editors for either national, senatorial, or congressional campaigns. Asma, I'm going to start with you. Let's say you had a crop of extremely talented journalists, and you had to fling them out into the country or just at the end of the block. Give me a couple of stories that you would assign these great reporters to cover that are part of this election. Again, it can be national, congressional, senatorial, or just the kind of story, and then give me your case, and I'll ask all three.
Sure. Well, great to be with you all. That is a big first assignment job that I've been taking on. Look, I will say that I am someone who has been perpetually fascinated by demographics of voters. It's kind of how I came into being, I would say, as a campaign reporter. So one of my jobs would be to assign actually a reporter or two to look at the demographics of what this electorate looks like. I think people assume sometimes that just means race. I think it means a whole lot more than race. I think it means geography. I think it means gender, a whole bunch of things. So yeah, I would focus on demographics. I also think that topically, the single storyline that I am most interested in, particularly after the midterms, that ties in with demographics, would be the effects of Dobbs and the effects of abortion in this election landscape. I don't know that there is any other issue, as we've seen even in the special election since, that seems to be changing the makeup of what this election could be compared to the previous presidential election.
John?
So, of course, the first story, John, is what is the best place to eat on the Strip? And reporters always appreciate being told that, of course. But seriously, Nevada, and I say that because Nevada is probably, none of you here would admit it, but a cliche to a lot of people, right? Still, it's the Las Vegas Strip. It's nothing else. If only that were so. The state, I've been covering politics there since 1986, and the state has both changed a lot and not changed at all. And I would tell reporters that, and I would say, listen, it's still all about Clark County, which is Las Vegas, which has 70% of the vote. And what is that vote in Clark County, and how has it changed? And Reno, which is the only other urban area, there are 15 counties in between. And I think you have to explain to people, because Nevada's really 3 states, and so you need to know that there's 3 areas. Clark County is overwhelmingly important, but Reno is kind of still quirky in a small town, and those 15 rural counties in between can make a difference in close races, even though they're only 10 to 12% of the vote. And so, as you rightly say, demographics are important, and Nevada's used to be a red state. Now it's a purple state, and the registration numbers in Nevada have changed tremendously. Independents and minor party candidates are now the majority of voters, or not the majority. They're the biggest number. They're about close to 40% now. Who are these people? How are they going to vote? What's driving them? Is it abortion? Is it something else? And that's a very difficult thing to get at, even for people who have covered politics there. For almost 40 years. I just dated myself, didn't I, John? So I think those are the main things that I would say.
As someone who's benefited from your restaurant recommendations, let's not undersell that portion of your remarks. Jeff?
Thank you. I definitely have, and look forward to going back to Nevada for a lot of those suggestions. But look, I think that one thing I would do first and foremost at this time of the campaign year, I would, as an assignment editor, assign my reporters or ask them to find the beginning of a relationship with voters. Find a pen pal. Every beginning of every presidential election cycle, and this can also be for House or Senate races, when you talk to voters, the engaged ones, the interesting ones, the ones who are curious, take down their name or number or email or text and create pen pals with some voters on your block, in your state, and stay in touch with them throughout the campaign cycle and see how their views of candidates change, see how their views of issues change, evolve. So at this point in the cycle, this early point in the cycle, and let's face it, this is the best part of a campaign cycle, the early season, because we're seeing new candidates, we're seeing fresh things, everything is uncertain. Embrace the uncertainty, don't act like you know more than you know, but find those pen pals. And I would also, as Asma was saying, the demographics are so important, but we also have a bit of a roadmap here. If Donald Trump happens to be the Republican nominee, and we do not know if he will, if he happens to be the Republican nominee, look at those, the voting results from 2016, 2020. Look at the neighborhoods and the counties and the cities in your community, and the results of those elections should form sort of a backdrop for what's to come. So just have the demographics in mind. But I think the second story as an assignment editor would be to really focus on the candidates. Do you have a George Santos sort of lurking among us? There should not be a George Santos coming out of the next election cycle. Every reporter in America should spend time Googling or learning who their candidates for office are, regardless of level, from city council to county council to state legislative races to congressional races, certainly. So get to know even some of the maybe fringe candidates. It could be a great story.
John, how do you get to know a candidate?
Well, you got to spend time with them, and you can't just ask them your list of questions. And the thing that most reporters have to learn to do, John, especially in politics, I think, and I learned this from hosting a television program, is don't talk so much. Listen, right? Just listen to what these people have to say, and pivot off of what they're actually telling you. Why they're running. I mean, this isn't, when you ask someone, I think it is the first question you should ask, why are you running? And it's really amazing that the answers that, give back to the community, I want to make a difference. Oh, okay, fine, that's great. But really, what guides you? What are you interested in? What issues matter to you? Where is your support coming from? Is your family on board? With this, there is. I was taught a long time ago a lesson. I'm sure all of you up here learn, which is no such thing as a stupid question. Just keep asking, but listen to the answers. Listen to what they're saying. Get a sense of where they're really coming from, and I mean their origin story and what shaped their views. And by the way, do they have any real views? That is the most stunning thing that you tend to find, and this can go all the way down from city council up to presidential races. Do they have any real views? Are they manufactured? Can they answer a follow-up question? And then listen very carefully to what they say, and of course always bring something to record what they say.
And there's another panel on how to talk to candidates who don't want to talk, so we won't linger on that question, though that is a part of our changing landscape. When we started in the business, there was this implicit recognition that you had to talk to reporters. That was part of your job as a candidate, not so much anymore. Asma, let me ask you about covering the issue. You mentioned abortion. So the changing landscape of abortion is changing by the minute. It may be changing while I'm finishing this sentence. So how would you take a hold, or how should we think about taking hold of that issue? You can imagine some of the people you would talk to. But if you want to be enterprising, if you want to be smart about it, what are some of the entry points for that issue that you would pick?
Sure. So, I mentioned demographics earlier because I do think demographics intersects with whatever topics that I often want to cover. So, one of the things I think that has been particularly helpful as a reporter is to figure out geographically, especially I guess I cover national politics, so where geographically I want to go. And one of the challenges as somebody who covers the nation is you perpetually feel like you're parachuting into a community and then you parachute out. So I spend a lot of time calling people, whether they are, local NPR affiliate journalists, people who know the community, local Democratic Republican county chairs. I also call national pollsters. I think pollsters have gotten, perhaps unfairly, I think at times, a bit of a bad rap in recent years. I don't think polling alone tells you the full story, but I would argue that polling in conjunction with good voter stories can give you a very good representation of what's going on in this particular political climate. So the example I mentioned is ahead of the 2022 midterms, I talked to a Democratic analyst and some pollsters who had done focus groups in Michigan. Michigan was very interesting in 2022 because the issue of abortion was quite literally on the ballot in a way that it was not elsewhere. I then decided I wanted to go to a particular area in Michigan. I spent a lot of time in 2022 looking at what are so-called boomerang counties. So these are counties that went for President Obama and then went for President Trump and subsequently for President Trump. Given how polarized the country is, quite candidly, I think there's only 16? I don't know. There's not very many of them because not that many places are actually that politically persuadable. I think those counties, they have been such rich fodder for stories because they're really where you see the cultural and political cracks, I think, happening. I did that in Florida, I did that in Pennsylvania. There are microcosms of the political conversation. And so I think that's a good place geographically to focus on because you will undoubtedly get a good cross-section of voters. But I think it's very helpful at a macro level to talk to people who are doing the focus groups. Allow yourself to be a fly on the wall sometimes. During a focus group session, you get a sense of the issues, and then you go into a community. I think going into a community without some understanding of what the issues are can be a bit overwhelming. Likewise, I just want to one other topic I spent a lot of time on ahead of the midterms last year was inflation. I had very clear sense of how big inflation was as an issue, spending time talking to Democratic pollsters, even some who were advising the Biden administration, as to how concerned they were with voters seeing rising prices. I then realized one way to quite clearly do this story would be to spend hours, as I did, outside of a Walmart where people are spending money. And I know it sounds like a very basic thing to do as a journalist, but it is an entry point in because you're going to the place where people are spending money.
And this builds on Jeff's point about having a pen pal, which I want to return to with you, Jeff, which is the, and I'll just load the question, the supremacy of talking to human beings who are voters constantly, unendingly, and why is that the right thing to do? And is it a perfect good? Or can sometimes all of these conversations with voters steer you in are the things you need to be careful of? Can you overstate how important it is to talk to voters, which I've now just done?
Sure, without question. I mean, there's not time or the bandwidth to talk to every voter, obviously, but voters should be a guide. I mean, the rule, I think, for a good story is talking to people who are involved in the story. So that's a political candidate, the officials, and voters. Voters are involved in the story. For any of you in a television news, and by way of background, I spent most of my time, I've covered most of my campaigns in print news, but in recent cycles, I've been in the electronic media, and of course we do both, but some producers call this MOS, man on the street. Like, no, they're actually voters. They participate in the process. So I'm a big proponent of talking to voters. Again, as Asma said, it sounds basic, but I think we really should talk and listen to voters. But I think that in particular this cycle, I was in Iowa a couple weeks ago doing some early reporting on the Republican presidential field, talking to Republican voters, and I thought, gosh, I wonder if I'm going to find any Trump exhaustion. And we read about, Trump is still controlling the party. I wonder if I will find sort of all points of view. And I was stunned how easy it was to find, Trump supporters, but as well as that Trump exhaustion from some people who voted for President Trump. So one thing I think the media has done incorrectly in terms of describing Trump voters is interviewing people only at Trump rallies. The vast majority of Trump voters have never gone to a Trump rally, have never stood in line for hours and hours and hours. For those of you who've covered Trump rallies, you've seen some of the same people at rally after rally after rally. These are groupies. These are people who are going for the show, for the rock concert, if you will. So I think talking to voters who are interested enough and following things along, but not as obsessed with the candidate on either side that it sort of tints the view. So I think talking to voters is a guide. It's not the only guide, obviously. But I think at this point of the cycle also, and I think we can't say this enough, we hear, oh, Ron DeSantis is collapsing, Donald Trump is rising. Perhaps, but I think we should embrace the uncertainty of this. What a great story. You all are covering stories that we don't know the ending to, so we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. We should not allow our assignment editors and the producers and others to sort of get ahead of things by saying, by acting like we know more than we know. And being in Chicago always reminds me of this. In 2007, and seeing David Axelrod here, I was working at the New York Times then, and boy, there were a lot of editors in New York who were just pretty convinced that Hillary Rodham Clinton would be the Democratic nominee. I was covering the Obama campaign, and I was noticing that my stories weren't always getting on the front page. I'm like, gosh, she's really taking off in Iowa. Something's sort of happening here. So at this point of that cycle, April of '07, and John, you were on the road, John, you were as well at the time, no one would have had any idea that Senator Obama would have been the nominee. So we have no idea who these nominees will be, at least on the Republican side. This year is probably not a perfect comparison because we have a former president in the race, obviously, but just embrace the uncertainty of all of this and make that part of the story.
Yeah, I'm sure I wrote both sides of that story. He's collapsing. Wait, how is she beating this guy?
Can I say something real quickly here?
Yeah.
Can I say this? First of all, I think Harry Reid knew that Barack Obama was going to be the nominee, but that's a different story. I want to bridge what Jeff said about voters and what Asma said about polling. Both are valuable. I do think that there are very few reporters who really go and talk to a wide enough cross-section of voters and know that they're doing it. I mean, Dave Weigel is a classic. He does a great job every time he goes into a community. But that can lead you astray. You've got to be very careful. What I found over the years covering politics is polling is invaluable if you know how to use it. And I was very inept at this when I first started and easily suckered by people like David Axelrod sending me a memo, a polling memo, and then you don't see the poll, and the pollster's written, boy, your candidate is in wonderful shape and he's going to win the election, and without saying anything else. Never just take that. Ask them for the entire polling instrument. If they won't give it to you, ask why. If they want to give it to you with some conditions, that can sometimes be okay. But it's the internals of the poll that both can tell you if it's a good poll and can lead you in some directions about, where are the better educated voters going, where are the less educated voters going. Polling can really tell you what's going on. In Nevada, it's been a real problem. Of course, because we're a very difficult state to poll, and only a few pollsters really have been able to capture it. But let me just say finally, the greatest moment, and this is on YouTube somewhere, was after Donald Trump won Nevada in the primary in 2016. He went and did a press conference in Reno and started reading the internals of a poll, and he said, oh my God, I got 70% of the poorly educated. I love the poorly educated. Which was kind of a seminal moment, right?
Yes, indeed it was. Asma, picking up a little bit on John's point there about polling and sometimes being given selective information by campaign aides. In the White House context, one deals with that all of the time. My first bureau chief at Time, when I covered the White House, said, anything a White House is saying that it shapes your view, be 10% more cynical about it. In other words, they're lying to you even more than you already think. Now, a lot has changed since then, and some people would now say that percentage should be 20%, 30%. But what's also true is, so I'd like you to rely on your experience in dealing with a White House, because now covering campaigns at any level has a lot of that. That kind of professionalism, which might be defined as more duplicity. So,
trying to control the narrative.
Yeah. How do you work around that, and yet also the necessity of dealing with people who are in the room and know what's going on? Because there's the other side, which is only the people in the room know what's going on.
Sure. I mean, I have found, it's interesting. I mentioned inflation earlier. So a lot of the inflation coverage that I did, I spent a good chunk of time talking about economic policy within the White House, is I talked to people who were polling and focus grouping, right? And this is how I first sort of got tuned. This was in May of, 2021, spring of 2021. I then went out to a community. I had hours and hours of tape from people talking about concerns about rising, food prices, gas prices, et cetera. I then went to the White House after that reporting, and I read verbatim quotes back to, Jared Bernstein, who's one of Biden's top economic advisors, where I would meet with Brian Deese. But I had the facts with me because I think one of the challenges, maybe not just of this White House, but I think covering any campaign, is that there is a desire to curate and control the narrative, like curate the story. And so, they can say, well, sure, we're paying attention to inflation, we're doing this, that, and the other. And I can say, well, I spoke to, 40 different self-identified Democrats the other day, and I spent a lot of time outside when I was interviewing people, and they said X, Y, and Z. And what is your response to them? Because I think that's a very helpful way to then pose the question to an elected official or to his staff to respond to voters rather than to my question, because I think it's very easy to dismiss my question. I think one of the other examples I would give is that this administration, I think, and I'm very interested in this, has maintained certain policies of Donald Trump's. I just did a big story actually on this, looking at industrial policy. They bristle at the idea that they have maintained some of Trump's policies, but I'm very interested in why they have done that, whether we talk about things like foreign policy, the Abraham Accords, or manufacturing. And I mention this because when you have the reporting done, it's very difficult for them to deny the reporting. So I often go to the administration after I have already done a solid amount of reporting.
Right.
Otherwise, they will try to curate the story and control what the story ought to be.
Jeff, in the old way we used to talk about campaigns, it was kind of like, should there be a lot of horse race coverage or should there be something else? And that question still exists, but it seems like it's gotten bigger, which is, in the attention economy we are all in now, every reporter has to fight what's getting a lot of attention versus what is important. And what does important mean? There was in the discussion yesterday with the two former party chairs, there was a lot of talk about the insides of the party, which you absolutely need to know, the insides of a campaign. But that's only a share of your larger issue set or story selection set. So how do you think through the following things? One, the shiny object that's getting all the attention. Two, what's important? And does important mean objectively important or important to voters? Because those are two different things. And then three, how much is the inside game, which is crucial to the ultimate outcome, something you can really do? Because often viewers watch and go, why are you telling me about delegate selection? Which I think was a little oversold yesterday, but anyway. How do you apportion that?
It's a great question. I think you have to know the rules because, in a sense, we're covering a game, a campaign. You have to know the rules of this process. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to burden your readers and viewers with all of the rules. But as we learned at the end of the last campaign, last presidential campaign in 2020, the rules of recounts and canvassing are very important. So I would not wait until the very end of the campaign to familiarize yourself with the rules of recounts or who the county clerks are, et cetera. I would just build up that knowledge of the election lawyers and other things, but don't necessarily burden your viewers or readers with them at this point. I think finding out what's important, we always say, oh, we're not going to chase that shiny object until we are chasing that shiny object. So I think when a story is a story. Don't necessarily fight it, but try not to be obsessed with only covering the shiny objects. And I think, we are been given a lot of shiny objects over the last couple election cycles. I suspect we'll be given several more in this one. I just think it's a case-by-case basis. Don't necessarily be overwhelmed by it. But if people in the grocery store or the shopping mall or outside Walmart, et cetera, are talking about it, then perhaps it's not a shiny object. Perhaps it's an issue in the race. So I think us making any rules or any producers or editors making any rules specifically about we are not going to cover this, we can't be quite as sanctimonious. We sort of have to follow what the interest is. And it's very much a chicken and egg thing. Are you creating the interest in the shiny object? Is the interest already happening? But at this point, we're not the only game in town, obviously. You can see what is trending. You can see what people have interest in. So I think using those things as guideposts are interesting. But one thing I think also as we think about this election cycle, the down ballot, I think will be so important. And we often don't focus as much on that when we're covering national campaigns or other things, but what the effect of the Dobbs decision will have on the down ballot races in this next election cycle, we don't know, but I think is something absolutely worth following and not being surprised. At the end of every election, I think the main goal as a reporter is that your viewers and your audience and your readers should not be surprised by the outcome. That does not mean that you predict the outcome or tell them what the outcome is, but there should be enough information sort of based in your reporting throughout the campaign cycle that the outcome should not be a surprise. So I think that should be a goal at this point of the race.
John, you perhaps are unique in the country in the sense that you are both able to view the disconnect between national reporters who come into your state and have thousands of opinions, but then you are also a source for a lot of those reporters who seek your guidance about what's going on. From that perspective, give us a sense of what are the typical mistakes that are made by people who come into a state thinking they know what's going on, and how can those people avoid that? And then, if you wouldn't mind stapling to that, how do you cultivate the expertise as a local reporter? Not because you want to inform national reporters who come in necessarily, but because that makes you a good local reporter. To know what's going on at the local and not be affected by all the noise that you're hearing from, major outlets with compelling personalities.
Well, let me answer the first part of that, for the second part of that first, John. The way that you become a good local reporter in campaigns and politics, the same way you become a good reporter in anything. You develop good sources. You figure out who are the people who have the good information, can be trusted if they tell you that something is going on. And that takes a long time, because some of these people who don't have good information are very good at delivering bad information. And that's a very, very difficult thing. And it can only come through experience, and you will make mistakes. And so it takes a lot of time. I run a nonprofit news operation now. I have a lot of young reporters, and I impart into them. You can't just go to the hearings in the legislature. You've got to cultivate sources. You have to actually, go to dinners and coffees and lunches, talk to these people. Even lobbyists have good information. You should talk to them. And so talking to as many people as possible, figuring out who these people are that you can trust. John, when I first started dealing with national reporters a lot, which was I think the 2008 campaign, all of them would say, how important is Yucca Mountain, which some of you may have heard about. You talk about a reporter-created story, and it was the big thing, the nuclear waste dump, and how does the presidential candidate stance on this going to affect? I mean, people in Nevada got inured to the issue of Yucca Mountain so long ago. It started in 1987. People just don't, and that is, again, where polling comes in handy, right? You can see in polling, if you trust the poll, you look at the internals, what people really care about. So when people ask me as to how big a deal is Yucca Mountain, I would deflate them by telling them that it wasn't that big a deal, but that people do care about instances. And by the way, I really enjoyed talking to Barack Obama, I remember this very well, about Yucca Mountain, since of course Illinois wanted to ship all of its nuclear waste to Yucca Mountain. And even back then he was very good at answering a different question, of course. But the issue of the gaming industry, for instance, casinos in Nevada, which provides all of the revenue, so we don't have an income tax, et cetera, and it's become much more of a global issue now. And how candidates and administrations, Democratic and Republican, have tried to put a federal arm on gaming. Like, how do you feel about that? These kinds of issues, they're important to people because a lot of people derive their livelihood either directly from or ancillary to the gaming industry. And so national reporters do need to learn more about the states that they cover, but it's not just about talking to me, although I enjoy it. It's always fun. But one of the reasons to talk to local reporters is because they can tell you who to trust and not to trust, right? And I think that's really important.
The sources you might be interviewing who might claim to know about the state, but in fact don't.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Asma, we're going to turn to questions shortly, so everybody be warned that we're headed towards that way. But I'll ask all of you this question, which is, what shouldn't we pay attention to? There's a lot to pay attention to, or I'll ask it this way. Is there a single ball to keep your eye on, and is there something that gets emphasized? So for example, here, I'll give you an example from when I covered the Hill. There were always editors who would pretend that there was a cabal of moderate lawmakers who were getting together finding solutions. Like John Breaux, the number of times people asked me what Senator John Breaux was doing, and it was this fake thing that we had to go chase down, and then it didn't exist, and then it was like you spent 2 days looking for the fake gang of however many that was going to deliver the solution that never came. So that was a thing where I would say, you know what, turns out the gang's not meeting, so don't go report on the gang meeting. Is there anything like that you would think of? Or alternatively, is there something that you think, people really should never lose sight of this?
Excellent question. I mean, if I go back to 2016, because I was struck, Jeff, when you said, you should always provide readers, listeners with information that they are not surprised. I think a lot of journalists were surprised in 2016. But if I look at the stories that even I did, that I'm like, clearly these signs were here, I think that's what I felt like. As a reporter, you need to trust your instincts and trust your reporting and listen to what you're hearing from folks. I give an example real quick of I was in North Carolina maybe a month before the election, went down to do a totally different story, but I had wanted to reconnect with a whole bunch of what you'd call kind of like super volunteers, grassroots organizers from the Obama era. What they told me was very alarming about how the Clinton campaign had not really invested in working with, there were clear warning signs. And I think you need to keep your eye on the ball of what you're hearing from like grassroots organizers and activists in different communities, because what they told me did not match what polling at that point in time was showing me. Same thing, I heard from somebody, this was just before the election, that there was a Beyonce Jay-Z concert, and that they could not give away enough free tickets to fill that stadium for Clinton. Huge alarm bell if you cannot give away enough free tickets, right, to fill the place for Beyonce and Jay-Z. But I think that those warning signs, you need to trust your instincts and dig deeper when you hear them, because I think if I look back to 2016, some of us saw warning signs, but that didn't match the polling maybe, it didn't match the broader narrative, and then you second guess what you keep hearing.
So picking up on that, Jeff, how do you tell your producers or editors in New York, either in any format that you work, who've read something that morning in the New York Times that they are certain now about, but you're experiencing a different reality, and then I'll add an added complexity. When you explain that reality and they say, well, you're obviously just captive to the campaign, how do you navigate those waters?
Well, how I do it now, and it happens often, I say, I used to work at the New York Times. I know how the sausage is. The story is either true or it's not. But I think one thing, you shouldn't push back on something that you missed, or someone that, there are a lot of smarter and better ideas out there. So I think you shouldn't resist necessarily. But I think this leads to the point of one thing to avoid is groupthink. I think as Asma was saying, trust your own instincts, trust your reporting, what you've been hearing, especially as the campaign is sort of moving along, say like a year from now or a year and a few months from now. Really trust everything that you've seen. And that doesn't mean be predictive necessarily, but I think this also gets to the point that history should be a guide. And in this time, we may have a fairly good sense of history in terms of the boomerang counties, because we have some of the same characters, but every campaign is different. We should not, the smartest political operatives are not fighting the last war, they're fighting the next war. And I think we should sort of approach that the same way. So history is a guide, not the only guide, but just spend more time talking to voters and operatives than talking to other reporters. No offense, John, I'll still give you a call when I'm not there. But I think avoiding the groupthink narrative is the biggest, one of the biggest
I echo that, yes.
Cautions.
John, I'm going to give you the, start lining up at the microphones, which there are 2 of them. So I was going to give John the first question when you all, as question askers, professional question askers, rush to the microphone. Do we now have a question in the pipeline?
Hi.
Oh, and say who you are and where you're from, if you wouldn't mind,
Yeah.
please.
I'm Angie Holan. I'm editor-in-chief of PolitiFact, the fact-checking website, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. And my question for the panel is, how are you thinking about covering policy this election cycle, especially like pocketbook issues of jobs, housing, healthcare, education, when it doesn't feel like we're in a very policy-heavy moment? Like a lot of the candidates have either cultural issues or issues of their personality. How do you think of bringing in policy coverage when it's not doesn't feel like a policy moment?
Go ahead.
So I've actually been fairly successful, John, and I know you appreciate this, in not turning every question into hyping the Nevada Independent. But I'm gonna change for this one, and that is this: it's one of the great things about having all these young reporters is they're not nearly, at least mine are, they're not nearly as interested in reporting on polls or the horse race. We do policy trackers. We ask all candidates about certain issues. We do our own polling so we know what the electorate is interested in. So we're very, very focused on that. And we, excuse me, I let my reporters, this would be a dream for me when I first started, write like 1,500, 2,000 word daily stories, diving deep into issues, and we hope that people read those, but at least they're out there for the record asking people about policy issues. Yes, we're gonna hear the culture wars, and they're gonna do all their stuff on that, and that's gonna resonate with people. But people need to know where they stand on X, Y, and Z, and so we've really made that a priority at our organization, as opposed to covering stuff that is, to use the parlance we've been using up here, the latest shiny object. And so we think that's really important. People are not like us. They're not crazy and follow this stuff 24/7. They want to make sense out of a very chaotic and increasingly complex world. Our job is to help them by illuminating where candidates really stand on issues.
And I think even asking it from presidential level, what do we mean when we talk about policy? Do we mean the policy the candidates are talking about? Do we mean the policy the voters want to hear about? Or do we mean what it means to be president, and what are the policies and questions we should be asking that get us some understanding about whether this person can actually handle the job they're applying for? So those are at least three different ways to define the idea of policy before you even are able to cover it, instead of covering the shiny object. Over here.
I'm Dan Petrella. I'm with the Chicago Tribune. Chicago's going to be hosting the Democratic Convention next year. Milwaukee will host the Republican Convention nearby. I'm curious what advice any of you have for covering both the lead up to the conventions, but the conventions themselves in substantive ways that aren't distracted by sort of the showbiz aspect of those productions.
Jeff, you want to?
Well, I think it'll be a great summer next year, Milwaukee and Chicago. I mean, two great American cities hosting these conventions. I think one thing to do here in Chicago, as always in Chicago, is, I mean, if not to follow the money, watch the money. I think the idea of contracts, the political parties obviously invest a lot of time and energy in contracts with unions, hotels, et cetera. The governor, of course, here has pledged to not pay for it himself, but he has pledged that the money will be there for it to be paid for. So I think following the money first and foremost. And I think also Chicago has become a bit of a caricature in some respects, particularly on Fox and some other networks, about what Chicago means in terms of crime, in terms of other things. I think just accurately reporting and sort of giving the background of what Chicago actually is and isn't, and there's obviously a new mayor, so there's just a slew of stories here. But I think beyond that, Chicago was picked because of the blue wall, to the north and to the east of here, in Wisconsin and Michigan. So I just think the whole regional aspect of this, is certainly very interesting. But the reality at this point, I was talking to Lynn Sweet earlier from the Sun-Times, a veteran Chicago correspondent who knows the city better than anyone, and she said there really hasn't been any controversy over Chicago since it was announced, as there might have been in Atlanta, because Chicago is, a progressive city, et cetera. So there may not be a lot of stories between like now and convention, but obviously the history of Chicago and conventions is so rich.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bridget Bergen from WNYC. I'm a politics reporter and host there. Jeff, you mentioned Representative George Santos. And now we shouldn't see a George Santos come through in 2024, but can any of you talk about what are some of the essential things that we as reporters should be doing when you're dealing with people who are presenting themselves to be one thing and they are very much something else?
You want to
Sure. I can start on that. I mean, so I used to be a local reporter in Boston, and and one of the things I think that you are able to do at a local level, I think perhaps more easily than at a national level, is really get to know the candidate and the people around the candidate. So for example, when I covered a governor, I often did interview his wife. I interviewed people who had worked with him in different capacities over the years. And I think that, it's easy to say this now, I think sort of Monday morning quarterbacking right about George Santos, but there were, it seems like, some red flags. And I think and I don't want to speak for Jeff here, but I think one of the signs is that you're able to talk to people around a candidate that should provide warning signs if they are giving, I think, inaccurate information. And I would just say that is something we all ought to be doing, is talking to people around the candidate, not just the candidate. On a national level, I think it is harder. I also think the national candidates are sometimes already so hyper-exposed that some of that information gets out there. But still, I think origin stories, someone mentioned earlier, are a great way to see. I did that for Buttigieg, for Warren, for a bunch of the candidates in the last election cycle. And you get a sense of whether or not their origin stories are always accurate or if there is some embellishment, and I think that that's important.
Hi, I'm Mary Ellen. I'm a politics reporter at Roll Call. I'm curious, as you're talking about talking to voters, one thing that I found going out to cover House and Senate races last cycle was that the voters going to campaign events were already deciding they were supporting the person there. They were a Republican, they were a Democrat. What's sort of the best way to balance, covering the campaign, covering the events when you have limited resources, but also, taking the time to go stand outside of Walmart for hours and try to find actual undecided voters?
Yeah, you can jump in. I think there's a few ways, but Jeff, you go.
I think one of the things is probably one of the worst places to interview voters is at a campaign event if they're already decided, unless they're there shopping. In Iowa or New Hampshire or Nevada or some early states, a lot of activists are there shopping. But I like to find people who are at least somewhat civically involved. If it's a library board meeting, a school board meeting, someone who's, I stand outside the post office sometimes. Just some level of civic engagement at any level might be sort of helpful. Or just, talking to people in a park. I think you should definitely look for people beyond the campaign event, or the diner, et cetera.
And if you're imprisoned at a campaign event, there are things you can ask about their daily lives, which have nothing to do with the candidate, which will be incredibly useful. And also, the best tip about Trump was in a spring Scott Walker rally I was at, because the person at the Scott Walker rally didn't really care about Scott Walker. Once Walker started talking, but was like, this Trump guy is really interesting. So
I think too, excuse me, is that this is why it's important to try to get as much information about a community before you go into it, because then you know where the places to go might be to get a good cross-section. Like, I'm just speaking about Las Vegas, I'll say some names, like go to Henderson, go to Summerlin, then go to downtown Las Vegas, and go here and you'll find these kinds of voters. And so, the biggest problem I've had is from national reporters, by the way, is that where's the diner that I can go to? And I always have to say, this isn't Des Moines or Concord. This is a different place for you guys. But you should, as Jeff said, go to a park in a suburban area that is known to be very Republican and see what the people there are saying. Ask people where to go.
Yeah, I really want to echo that. I think parks, actually, specifically as we talk about issues of abortion and suburban communities, I think going and zeroing in on the community that you want to go to is very key, because if you were to go to, I'm just saying, last elections, like Kenosha, for example, it was a relevant, important area, Kenosha, Wisconsin. You then decide where you want to go to, and within that place, you can find parks, open spaces that people are hanging out at. And I have never found, especially as we inch closer to an election cycle, that you won't find people who are engaged. Even if they don't intend to vote, they will often have thoughts. The other thing I want to mention real quick, though, is I think Republican county meetings or Republican, like young Republican clubs, same on the Democratic side, are really helpful because, especially if we're talking about an open, primary right now on the Republican side, chances are, I just did this in Florida recently, you go to the, Republican Women's Club or the Young Republicans Club, you may find a diversity of thought within the Republican club, which I think is a good
We have time for one last question.
Okay, fire away.
Hi there, Adam Rye from CBS News in Milwaukee, local CBS. This is so much about context. This panel, perhaps the whole conference today, is about context. For those of us who are limited by time, maybe a question for the TV people up there as well, but 90 seconds does not provide a lot of time for context. So recommendations for those of us on the TV side or anyone struggling with the time or space to provide context.
It's a great question. I think, one of the luxuries there is, in addition to the 90 seconds, you obviously have an online product or whatnot. So I would just encourage you to write more longer form things online, or sort of be creative and entrepreneurial and pitch a segment for digital or something, or a weekend show where, just name it, the Wow County voters are talking or something, and just get into, try and get a little bit more time. Obviously in the nightly newscast that's not possible, but there's a lot of newscasts and contents from morning to evening, so maybe try and package something sort of differently. But I think at the very least, the context, and Wisconsin will be ground zero for, it's one of the most important, interesting states, obviously, so just the context of how Trump did in one place in 2016 versus 2020 versus 2024, how Biden did, how Clinton did. I think just the context of the history of Wisconsin, like even in 90 seconds, I think you can include some of that, or how the Supreme Court race was, just used of past examples, to sort of inform the future. But I think the bottom line, be entrepreneurial and try and pitch something beyond the 90 seconds if you can. I know resources are limited, and it's easy for me to say, but I think it's worth it.
And there's also apparently at CBS a national streaming show that is interested in actual reporters who are there where things are happening. So in addition to our great reporters,
John, what's your number? Do you know anyone you can suggest for?
It's a rumor I've heard. All right, I guess that's it. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you all of you panelists, and good luck with the rest of the day.